I've posed a rather interesting question. Was Hamlet a triumphant spin-off from Gorbodoc and Tamburlaine? And I'd like to start by taking you back to a time of crisis in Tudor history, the period of only 18 months between the execution of Mary Stuart in February 1587 and the rout of the Spanish Armada in July 1888, when we managed under dire threat to preserve our religious and political identity and then defend our very nationhood against physical attack. But that short time also coincided with a third assertion of English sovereignty, when we struck a decisive blow for independence in matters determining our culture and language. This was delivered by Christopher Marlowe. In February 1587, this young man was still at Cambridge, completing both his MA studies and the draft of a new play, Tamburlaine the Great. When July 1588 came, he was down in London, already established with a theatrical success behind him and a popular following. His new way of writing plays was soon to be widely emulated. London had been plunged into a frenzy of literary renewal that would redirect our culture and even our society forever. The public presentation of blank verse drama rapidly established itself, and would-be writers and actors were arriving in the city to compete for show business rewards. Hundreds of plays would be written and performed in 2 or 3 decades, and impresarios enriched themselves. It was like a gold rush. We have the impression of a maelstrom of literary endeavour, resulting haphazardly in plays good and bad, only a few of which have come down to us. In fact, the whole process is slightly less arbitrary and accidental than it may now appear. A strong central backbone ran down the middle of Elizabethan blank verse drama, composed of 3 closely related works. The prototype play, Gorbodoc, 1561, the first triumph, Tamburlaine, 1587, and the masterpiece Hamlet of 1601. 4 men were involved in the introduction and maintenance of this modern way of writing for the English theatre in a new age. The first of these was Sir William Cecil, chief advisor to the Queen, who commissioned, supervised and protected Gorbodoc over his last 40 years and recalled it to public memory virtually on his deathbed. Then came Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville, who wrote him an iconoclastic play in respectable verse, though they lacked the ability to exploit the infinite potential of the new medium. This remarkable feat was eventually achieved following a whole generation of emptiness with Tamburlaine. 15 years after that, Hamlet would signal its own provenance in unmistakable back references to Tamburlaine and overt borrowings from Gorbodoc. The tragedy of Gorbodoc was written in 1561 and unsuccessfully performed only a couple of times by young amateur actors before a tiny invited audience which included on one occasion Queen Elizabeth. To this day, very few people have heard of this unassuming piece, yet it was nothing less than a slow-burning bombshell that escaped attention even when it blew a great hole in centralised European classicism. Forgotten for a whole generation, Gorbodoc re-emerged to change the course of English letters so radically that it now deserves retrospective acknowledgement as a major determinant of our modern culture and language. The play had a political purpose. In her accession speech of 1558, probably written for her by Cecil, Elizabeth had publicly installed this man as her chief advisor, on the tacit assumption that she would follow his advice. But she didn't always do so, and her headstrong behaviour soon became a matter for concern. In what looks like an attempt to bring her back into line, Cecil turned to a couple of his legal protégés and commissioned from them a didactic Christmas play, with himself as the main character, Eubulus, chief advisor to the monarch, who enjoys the largest part by far, all the best scenes and all the best lines, and for good measure his Greek name means prudent counsellor. King Gorbodoc, much like King Lear decades later, brings about his own downfall by dividing his country unnecessarily between his children, against good counsel from his closest advisor. This failure to listen constitutes the main theme of the play, in which there are more than 40 uses of the word counsel, advice, or read, permutated with accompanying adjectives like grave, good, sage, sound, wise, wholesome. Every one of these signals rings out like an ironic echo of Elizabeth's accession speech. And you have to say that the obsessive overuse of this concept amounts to blatant didacticism, one of the obvious failings of the play as entertainment. The four official advisors, 2 in real life and 2 in literature, that is, Cecil and Eubulus in Gorbodoc, followed by Lord Burleigh and Lord Polonius in Hamlet, are unmistakably one and the same person. This is the first indication of a strong connection between the prototype blank verse tragedy and the masterpiece that succeeded it 40 years later. There are many more. There are obvious weaknesses in Gorbodoc as a staged play. The lack of well-developed characters and any eye-catching activity, along with stilted speechifying penned by writers more accustomed to student moots than to everyday dialogue. Despite breaking many rules of classicism, the play failed largely because it still followed Seneca too closely. His tragedies were not written for acting, but for a long series of formal speeches. The intrepid authors should have been just a touch more revolutionary. However, these drawbacks do not undermine the artistic significance of the play through its potential for infinite exploitation. The young writers had invented, maybe fortuitously, a new formula for drama, which, in the right hands, was capable of raising the English language to a new level of expressiveness over an unlimited range of matter and manner and meaning. The curious thing is, there's nothing mysterious or magical about the way this formula worked. The hidden secret of Gorbodoc's new method for verse tragedy was straightforward and practical. The reduction of a long classical line, say the hexameter, into a shorter form, cutting it down from 6 feet to 5, a pentameter. This may not seem earth-shaking, but it creates 2 new conditions that will prove invaluable. Brevity, enhanced by asymmetry. A 5-foot line need not be padded out, nor can it be broken into 2 equal halves. These new features of verse were further fortified by casting off the shackles of rhyme, itself a powerful provider of repetitive symmetry. And that is blank verse in a nutshell. No long lines, no symmetry, no rhymes. This new elixir of freedom, bringing literary English much closer to the spoken word by the removal of artificialities, created alluring new possibilities. Alas, it was one thing to create an epoch-making formula, but quite another to realise its full potential straight away. In 1561, both Marlowe and Shakespeare have yet to be born, and Hamlet is still 4 decades away. The two authors of Gorbodoc were dauntless innovators and competent versifiers, but neither of them amounted to what was needed, a genius of letters. So, the whole question of further reform went to sleep for a whole generation. Now, the next stage in this strange, eventful history has been well documented and need not be dwelt on here. Suddenly, the sleeping challenge of Gorbodoc was newly awakened, and the response to it was remarkable, thanks to one young man, a young genius, scarcely out of his teens. An eloquent summary of what happened is provided for us, first by A.N. Wilson, who refers to a pyrotechnic fizz in the London sky, and then by Ted Hughes, adding detail. He says, "The lightning flash that brought the theatre to life was not Shakespeare, but Christopher Marlowe, who exploded onto the English stage in 1587 with Tamburlaine Parts 1 and 2. Almost as a single stroke, he invented the drama for the new age. The astounding panache and brilliance of his spirit established a prototype drama that threw open heaven and hell and licensed all the ferocity of the Elizabethan dream." The only flaw in this colourful but deserved encomium is that it refers to Marlowe's work as being without controlling precedents. This is hardly fair to Gorbodoc, the actual pioneer play. Nor does it occur to Hughes to cast a glance forward at Hamlet. Why should he? He, like everyone else, is unaware of the rich blood relationship between all three of our most significant English tragedies, Gorbodoc, Tamburlaine and Hamlet. The true prototype play flopped back into obscurity, while Marlowe rather disingenuously claimed all-round originality in the effective manifesto for New English drama provided by his prologue to Tamburlaine. And obscurity is still the homeland of this remarkable work. It is rarely discussed by Shakespeare experts, who refer to it only for two useless purposes: to give it a passing mention as one of the earliest plays written in blank verse, or to emphasise and exaggerate its shoddy quality in terms of poetry and entertainment. This has created a state of scholarly affairs that needs to be redressed. The problem is well represented in recent works by the two leading Shakespeare specialists. The historical facts concerning Gorbodoc, long established in bits and pieces, but never gathered together in celebration or taught with conviction today, if mentioned at all, are at variance with the latest thinking on this subject by today's authorities. For instance, a recent book by Sir Jonathan Bate, How the Classics Made Shakespeare, informs us that William Shakespeare, with the classical nature of his imagination, there are quotation marks there, but they're not explained, and his classical intelligence, worked in a theatrical profession that had inherited the conventions and forms of classical drama. This implies that Shakespeare took on the classical writers at their own game, in their own style, and managed to surpass even their high achievement. And this assertion, developed over hundreds of pages, seems to me to be the exact opposite of what we know to have happened in real life. In truth, the high quality of Elizabethan drama depends not upon its adherence to a classical inheritance, some vestige of which is of course inevitable, but on the degree to which this was ignored, rejected, or transcended. Clearly, the author of those English plays had a classical education, but so did all educated people of that time. They often spoke and wrote to each other in Latin. But that does not mean that the classics made Shakespeare. Let us speak plainly. Shakespeare's work is what it is, not because of Aristotle, Plautus and Seneca, but because of Gorbodoc and Tamburlaine. Elsewhere, we're reminded that no fewer than 13 of Shakespeare's 40 or so works are set in the world of ancient Greece or Rome. This constitutes 1/3 of his corpus. This is indeed true, but the masterpieces are not among those works, which seem to demonstrate the opposite principle. The further you get away from Greece and Rome, the greater the quality of the drama. The finest of the tragedies, and you know which ones I have in mind, have more recent settings in Verona and Mantua, Elsinore, Denmark, Venice and Cyprus, Britain, Scotland and England. And the 10 history plays, including some of the best works and the finest poetry, do not go back 2,000 years, nor do they stray geographically beyond England, France and Wales. Sir Jonathan seems to have erred in his early years by accepting at face value the superficial judgments of earlier critics like Hazlitt, who claimed that, as a work of genius, Gorbodoc may be set down as nothing, a statement that Bates in his younger years endorsed as simple, important and empirically true. And a similar example of underestimation can be seen in the works of Sir Stanley Wells, as summarised in a short book recently published, Shakespeare's Tragedies, A Very Short Introduction. Sir Stanley seems to be aware overall that some shift away from an old system of rules towards formal liberty must have occurred, much to the benefit of the incoming William Shakespeare, but the moment of change is not identified or marked out as an event of special significance. The author is distracted by the idea that the form and style of Shakespeare's tragedies were substantially affected by the physical conditions of the playhouses. Although generous to Marlowe, he devotes twice as much space to Thomas Kyd, while the only work that really matters in this context, the tragedy of Gorbodoc, is not even mentioned. This leaves us in danger of leaving newcomers to Shakespeare underinformed and somewhat misled. The continuing oversight leaves a gap in the record of our cultural development, and it also disregards the fertile and definitive relationship between the early prototype and the culminating masterpiece. Without this information, our knowledge of Hamlet remains incomplete. Close examination of the Gorbodoc, Tamburlaine, Hamlet progression unearths a complex of new material at every level, from tiny details to broader preoccupations and large-scale borrowing that almost beggars belief. Let us begin with one or two details. Young Hamlet's very first words in response to Claudius's self-advancement as a surrogate father are these: "A little more than kin and less than kind." They resonate against Queen Vidina's words in lines 17 to 18 of the earlier work. "A father? No. In kind a father, not in kindliness." This startling association between two versions of troubled fatherhood and sonship is unlikely to have arisen by chance. With two puns punned against each other, the very first words spoken by the world's best-known tragic hero signal kinship with the source of their genre. And the ending of the play also recalls Gorbodoc in the carrying out of Hamlet's body by four captains to military music exactly matching the dispatch of the poisoned king at the end of the earlier dumb show. This solemn envoy gently ties the two works together just as they were likely conjoined at the outset. But this brings us to the greatest shock of all. The two plays are brought together indissolubly by that very dumb show, which unites them at the absolute heart of Hamlet in an unparalleled literary smash and grab. Gorbodoc provides a dumb show at the beginning of all 5 acts. The second of these matters most, since it has been carried forward for wholesale reuse in Hamlet. The later play exactly follows all the procedural details of the former, a dozen or more. The points of correspondence are worth noting. In both plays, the dumb show is announced in the text of the play. That's 1. To begin with a musical introduction, 2. By a small brass ensemble, 3. A king enters, 4. Accompanied, 5. Someone kneels before him, 6. He makes himself comfortable, 7. And is given solicitous attention, 8. Another man enters, 9, bearing poison to murder the king, 10. He succeeds in administering the poison, 11. The king dies on the spot, 12. 3 or 4 men solemnly carry his corpse away, 13. The music ceases, 14. The ingenuity of this strange manoeuvre is remarkable, since the circumstances of the two narrative situations are not the same, even though they both depict the poisoning of a royal person. The perfect blending of two different assassinations with two similar ceremonial descriptions has been carried out with meticulous, you could almost say amusing exactitude. Somehow or other, is this just coincidence? Both sets of stage directions come to exactly the same total of 119 words. A similar accuracy also attends the placing of the new dumb show precisely in the middle of the better-known play. Deliberate centralisation of the piece must have been planned. This is the moment of peripeteia, sudden, irreversible change. Once Claudius is confronted with the depiction of his murderous behaviour, there can be no going back. And yet, the borrowed dumb show turns out to be superfluous. The audience does not need it because old Hamlet has already given us a lurid account of his murder. This doesn't apply to the persons in the play who were not privy to that message, but the problem with the dumb show is that Claudius shows no sign of watching it. It's a safe bet that this item, although only a few minutes long, is usually omitted from performances in order to shorten a very long play. What will signify is Claudius's noticeable reaction to the same story on its third appearance within The Murder of Gonzago. If the dumb show has no useful function, why is it there at all? We're left wondering whether its main raison d'etre could be little more than that of a hidden tribute to the authors of Gorbodoc. It was an act of considerable perversity to clone a whole scene from their play, but to include it without clothing it in relevance looks almost playful. That may sound rather jokey, but Hamlet is famous for wrapping tragedy in comedy. Herbert Tree claimed that in this play, the firmament of tragedy is made blacker by jewels of humour. One such gem may be seen in a small detail that looks more like a whimsical insertion than a meaningful piece of narrative, drama or poetry. When the leader of the strolling players recites a memorized version of Priam's slaughter at the hands of Pyrrhus, the violent narrative is absurdly halted in mid-flow. Uniquely, among the many versions of this story, the hero paused in mid-murmur and then did nothing. Upon which the pentameter is discontinued, and these three syllables, did nothing, make up the shortest line in the play, neatly halving a long speech of 28 full-length pentameters. Did nothing glares up from the page calling for attention. You don't have to be Dan Brown to spot the probable meaning. If nothing equals O, DID plus O equals Dido. This small shock delivers more recognition than surprise, since the same name pops up like an earworm leitmotif in 10 plays of the accredited Shakespeare canon. Now, from all of this, and there is a lot more, two important things emerge. First, it is clear that the author has intimate knowledge of the pioneering work and is likely to have been working with this text in front of him. By the way, there were no odd copies of the play lying around in theatre cupboards, because this play never emerged from court circles into the real world, and when Hamlet was being written, 4 solid decades had disappeared into history. Second, it is clear that the tragedy of Gorbodoc had a very significant impact on the very fabric of Hamlet, an undeniable effect that seems to have gone unnoticed. But there's another way, equally unnoticed, in which the creative power of this early play exerted itself, by irradiating the entire field of subsequent Elizabethan drama with familiar and persistent obsessions. Step back from 1587 to 1561, a whole generation, and you will find there, awaiting rediscovery, a farrago of ideas, personalities, situations, attitudes, events, and formal methods, mainly the striking advantages of blank verse, that characterise the plays ascribed to William Shakespeare. Look carefully, and you may find yourself admitting that these familiar things saw the light first in Gorbodoc. This will apply to any or all of the following notions, most of these apparent in Hamlet itself: the kingdom, the realm, Britain, England, royalty, rank and title, family relationships, especially fathers and sons, obedience, jealousy, disunity, and the horrors of civil war, the danger of foreign incursion, skillful governance, the uses of power, death, murder, vengeance, parricide, regicide, justice, counsel versus flattery, right versus wrong, nature, reason, the gods, non-Christian, and mirrors of truth. The familiarity of such expressive terms is remarkable. We've encountered them dozens of times on page and stage. There are so many familiar plays to which these lines could reasonably be ascribed. Conversely, here are 3 complete lines from the separate plays which would seem to be absolutely interchangeable. The first one from Gorbodoc is, "And nature that did make this equalness." And from Tamburlaine comes, "Nature that framed us of 4 elements." And in Hamlet you will read, "To hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature." It is no exaggeration to claim that the entire Shakespeare-accredited canon is awash with the ethos and vocabulary of the foundational play, with its expansive and profound thematic spread, and many a literary flourish left around waiting to be discovered, enjoyed, reused, or developed. When you return to the later works, keeping an eye open for specific parallels, crossing a generation of emptiness, there will be moments of sudden recognition in almost every play, thrilling the reader by the strong grip of their closeness to a forgotten work written decades before. To take a single instance, consider Eubulus at the end of his play, fulminating with prophetic fury over what is sure to happen to his beloved country now that it has lapsed into long-term civil strife. The whole situation will remind everyone of John of Gaunt in Richard II, whose vision of England, now and for years to come, is exactly that of Eubulus himself. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself applies precisely to both situations. And among the coming brutality will be every kind of atrocity, including this repellent idea, first expressed in the earlier work by Eubulus. One kinsman shall bereave another's life. The father shall unwitting slay the son. The son shall slay the sire and know it not. Such a sanguinary prediction, issued in 1561, is made flesh 30 years later in Henry VI Part 3, where the earlier theme is picked up with terrible exactitude. I quote from the play, Alarum, enter a son that hath killed his father with the dead body. And he says, who is this? Oh God, it is my father's face, whom in this conflict I unawares have killed. And later on, enter a father that hath killed his son with the body in his arms, who says this, but let me see, is this our foeman's face? Oh no, 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 it is mine only son. And to this may be added a brief extract from the closing speech of Richard III, declaimed by Richmond. England hath long been mad and scarred herself. The brother blindly shed the brother's blood. The father rashly slaughtered his own son. The son compelled been butcher to the sire. Wherever you find yourself in post-Gorbodoc Tamburlaine theatreland, you will be constantly assailed by concepts, situations, characters and poetic method unmistakably retraceable to Marlowe, and through him straight back to the richly fertile source of modern English drama created in 1561. There is abundant evidence of blood ties great and small binding Gorbodoc to the Shakespeare canon. You will not find a vestige of this in any other pre-Tamburlaine play. Gorbodoc stands out in this respect like a solitary beacon of prefigurement. So much for the impact of Gorbodoc on Tamburlaine and all the subsequent plays of this ilk. Beyond that, what needs to be confirmed is any direct evidence of Tamburlaine's own impact on the future plays. Well, there is so much of this, it's hard to know where to begin. One researcher has listed 200 such correspondences, including no fewer than 78 references to Tamburlaine. This Marlowe play is the single channel through which the lifeblood of Gorbodoc was transfused with enrichment into the newborn body of English Renaissance drama. An obvious hypothetical question now presents itself. What if there had been no resistance to classical authority in English drama? Let us imagine that no one else had spotted an opportunity to cut the traces and give dramatic speech unlimited freedom to roam. The prospects were not good. Forces of conservatism were gathering that would have insisted upon the safe way forward for English letters. The message was, follow the classical writers and all will be well. And this is precisely what the French writers decided to keep on with even a century later. And that led to an endless stream of tedious Alexandrines churned out in thousands by Racine and Corneille. They even imposed further strictures like rime riche, don't ask for details if you don't know, and stationed thought policemen like Boileau and Voltaire to watch for the slightest suggestion of impurity. Does any non-French theatre lover prefer the French tragedians to Shakespeare? In their own terms, of course, the French were quite right to maintain these standards. Anything less would have been to sacrifice dignity and virtue on the altar of vulgarity. Shame on the English, we opened our hearts to that disgusting tendency, enjoyed by so many and by all classes in the burgeoning Elizabethan theatre. But at that time, most English writers were against any change. This applied to Sir Philip Sidney, self-appointed arbiter of the rights and wrongs of poetry, also to Areopagus, a group of theorists who planned ways of preserving classical metres in a modern context, also to Thomas Preston, author of Cambyses, King of Persia. And that play consists of 1,250 excruciating 14-syllable lines in rhyming couplets. You won't enjoy it. Also George Chapman, who wrote thousands of these same interminable lines in his translation of the Iliad. Also of Edmund Spenser, the author of The Fairy Queen, an allegorical epic poem of 30,000 lines, arranged in 250 stanzas of 9 lines each, rhyming A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. To follow the rhyme scheme of a single stanza is like solving a cryptic crossword. Now, all of these writers and most of the others shared a similar attitude based on the self-evident need to preserve the nobility of literature with which the common people must not be entrusted because they would only debase it. And what eventually came about was just what these people had feared. Within a generation, the theatre began to work from the ground upwards. So common did it become that a successful play would allow passing mention of a mouse and a rat, put 2 clowns on stage with a garrulous grave digger working by an open grave and tossing skulls around, and allow a demure young woman to share a joke with a suitor lying at her knees who speaks about country matters with emphasis on the first syllable. Another play of the same period encourages a foreigner learning English to mispronounce the vocative as fuckative. Sexual punning became almost de rigueur. Even worse, kings could be reduced to sitting down upon the ground and chatting about death and so on. By the time of Hamlet, anything goes. The literary revolution that almost didn't happen was actually a triumph of democracy. One aspect of it is shown by a recent book cover promoting a book called Filthy Shakespeare, which claims that Shakespeare is stuffed with wordplay so filthy it would make even our most risque comics blush. I blush to report its further claim that the works of William Shakespeare contain over 400 puns on the word for the penis and vagina. But his work is also famous for containing sublime poetry and serious ideas on almost every other page. These are the 2 extremes. Between them, they embrace all human experience, and they do that in a verse form as near as you can get to everyday speech, albeit laced frequently with beauty and grandeur. This healthy range of acceptable reference did not come from Plautus, but it did descend naturally inevitably from the liberating spirit of Gorbodoc and Tamburlaine. You will not find anything like it in Racine. You would not have found it in Shakespeare if he had indeed been made by the classics. And we can't leave the tragedy of Gorbodoc without returning to its unique role in the history of English printing. It may have been our first serious history and tragedy and our first play in blank verse. But as we've seen, its shortcomings made for poor entertainment, and it was immediately forgotten. Nevertheless, at a time when hardly any plays were published at all, this unwanted work was published in quarto on 3 occasions spaced out over a generation. So here we have a play with more publications than performances. We cannot be certain why this came about, but at least we know how. It was done at the behest of Cecil, and there was no shortage of funds to be wasted on such an empty project. The various editions were financed from within a profitable cartel of Protestant publishers under his close control. Beyond that, however, there is an even more puzzling turn of events. The same work, although not republished in full, was re-evoked artistically in 1597 by the same man, now of course Lord Burleigh. This famous statement, the very progenitor of Gorbodoc, when virtually on his deathbed, sneaked a slightly expanded version of its title page emblem of 1565 onto another title page, that of a celebrated botanical survey of 1597. So the person who engendered the play in 1561 and launched it on a checkered career in published form also put an end to its tortuous existence no less than 36 years later. This could not have been an empty gesture, and certainly not a joke. There has to be a meaning behind this last appearance, which consists of an imitative emblem now made up of 8 or 9 letters of the alphabet. This appears to be a message, presumably concerning the English theatre. This is addressed to posterity. The long time lapse ensured that no one of Burleigh's dying day would associate a small device originating in a long-forgotten play with something similar re-arising in a small corner of a special title page in a sumptuous book of horticulture, and no one did. The biggest shock of all, to some of today's readers presented with the device of 1565, is that many of them will realise they had seen this design before, in 2015. As recently as that, a present-day botanist, Mark Griffiths, suddenly claimed to have discovered a title page from 1597 containing a physical likeness of William Shakespeare and a cryptic emblem encoding his name. This thesis was angrily dismissed without real discussion by a few busy scholars. It is true that Griffiths had claimed too much, made mistakes, and failed to consider why any message concerning Shakespeare, along with his portrait, should have been delivered in its day obliquely, under a veil of secrecy and deception. What had he done to deserve that? But with 2 similar emblems before us, this complex matter must now be properly readdressed. For the time being, all we can do is present these 3 emblems to the world and invite comparison between them. There are actually 2 versions in 1565, one on the title page and one on the last page. We may as well consider both of them alongside the later version of 1597. A way must be found in the near future of publishing these items and inviting a debate. it may be worth briefly mentioning some of the curious features that we'll have to take account of. Some extra letters were added in 1597, and these will need to be accounted for. A prominent sign of 4, a very early printer's mark, has been swivelled, but this is of no consequence. It can point west or east. The letters W and M, standing for William Griffith, the first publisher, underpin all 3 designs. And a central letter G of 1565 was actually at its clearest in the last page version of the emblem rather than the one on the title page, has been exploded into the more obvious versions of O and R, centrally located in the 1597 adaptation. There may be good reason, incidentally, to make this combination, to take it at face value as the word or, meaning also known as or otherwise called, as in Twelfth Night or what you will. Beyond this, all that needs to be said for the moment is that this is a grid in which ambiguity prevails. Is that an incomplete A at top centre? Is that an E or an L or even both of them to the right? Why is there a redundant flying splodge to the right of the R? Why indeed should slipshod imperfections characterise the later device of 1597 and not the earlier one of 1565, which is exquisitely finished in every detail? Heraldry, from which these devices are a modest offshoot, demands perfection in every detail. Burley, a wealthy perfectionist, had hired William Rogers, the finest engraver of his day. Can this botched inscription really be from his burin? This it must surely be the case. So, in view of his expertise, how can we accept the ambiguity as anything but deliberate? These are all questions that must be resolved if we are to understand the meaning of the last emblem. But there for the future, the subject will be contentious, and we cannot allow it to contaminate today's broader discussion of plays before Hamlet. On that subject, it is appropriate to acclaim the significant contribution of today's scholars to the vast expanse of Shakespeare studies. They have applied themselves with enthusiasm and acumen to the very essence of our national culture and extended our understanding of it. Their efforts have not gone unacknowledged, and the high honours bestowed upon them properly signal the value of their entire discipline. It is due to their combined efforts that a thoughtful piece in the Times recently posed this question in all seriousness: what is England now apart from sport and Shakespeare? Nevertheless, it remains possible, even for enthusiastic outsiders not directly qualified in this field, to question some of their attitudes and suggest some degree of alternative thinking. That is the purpose of today's discussion, which has turned up some new ideas. So in response to the question posed at the outset, we can safely claim that Hamlet is indeed a triumphant spin-off from Gorbodoc and Tamburlaine, the 2 works which together introduced a new age of English drama based on the freedom gained from the use of blank verse. But there's nothing special about this factor. It is true of the entire canon of literature attributed to both Marlowe and Shakespeare. We've taken issue with the idea that Shakespeare was somehow made by the classics. In our opinion, he is at his strongest when furthest away from classical influences. English Renaissance drama is a corporate phenomenon, a substantial body with a solid backbone composed of 3 similar plays: Gorbodoc, Tamburlaine and Hamlet. A profusion of cross-references, some of them assertive, some subtle, between the earliest play and the many that followed, give clear evidence of close kinship, embracing these works and their entire genre. William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, is of prime importance in this rather complex story. He has the unique distinction of being clearly depicted on stage in 2 of the 3 central tragedies. He may have initiated the Gorbodoc play inadvertently, but once it was there, he fostered it over decades, and his thoughts near to death were still with it. He seems to have left us a message about the English theatre of his day. This has yet to be acknowledged, discussed and explained. All the details needed for an informed discussion of this contentious topic are now available. This is a substance of our new argument concerning English Renaissance drama. All that needs to be added is a near quotation from the great poet himself, whoever he may have been. Sonnet 116 ends with a well-known couplet. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Please accept a new modernised version of it. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never drank, nor no man ever brewed. Thank you.